Hello there, it's Sandy Allnock with this month's Create in Color. And it's going to be watercolor because it is World Watercolor Month. And I'm going to be doing some negative painting using these sweet birds. And I'll be stamping them all on the card. And the tip I want to give you today is really a general tip about negative coloring. And I do this a lot in a lot of my artwork, and people are like, how do you know what to do for the negative coloring? Well, I'm going to do it with masking, so that you can get maybe a clearer idea of the way that I'm thinking through the negative painting or negative coloring. And you can do negative coloring with all mediums. I do it mostly with my watercolors. But what I have done is stamped the birds and masked them, and then stamped once with each of the leaves. But what I'm going to do now is just place the leaves so that some of them are over the masks, but I didn't feel like cutting out all those little shapes. So I'm putting them next to each other, not masking them out from each other. So I only had to mask out the birds, and the rest of it doesn't really matter. So I can take off all my masks, and there's a lot of gaps in there. This looks very random, like there's all kinds of holes in there. You could do this next step without using the pen to do it. You could do it with a pencil, of course, but you could also do it just while painting, which is how I do it when I do my fine art paintings. But for crafters, to get this into your brain, I would suggest coming up with some kind of background with whatever kind of thing you want to paint, and stamp a whole bunch of them and then draw in some shapes that seem to be in the back. I'm making very simple leaf shapes. I'm not doing fancy leaf shapes like the ones that are in the stamps, because those are going to carry the day. Nobody's going to care about all these little shapes I'm drawing. So I am even deliberately drawing them badly so that you can see this works even if you don't have a lot of drawing skills. You just stamp all of whatever the background is around it, and then paint right through it all. I'm going to paint through everything except for the birds, and I'm leaving that center section just because I'll show you real quickly how to make a waterfall, because they're in the tropical forest and they deserve to have a nice refreshing waterfall. I'm feeling the heat very much myself, and I felt the need to give the birds a little respite as well. So I mixed up a green with my sap green and some nickel azo so I could get a lighter color, because in this step you want whatever your color is to be what you want the lightest one to be. And then you're going to add darker colors to it. But see how easy this is? Like, this first step everybody can do. Don't tell me you can't paint, because you can do this. And then dry it really well. If you don't dry it really well, you can still move on to the next step, but this is going to be easier if it's really dry. I mixed up some sap green by itself that is thicker than the color that I mixed with nickel azo. So it comes out a little bit darker. It's also going to be easier to work with if it's a little bit thicker, because you're trying to get into the nooks and crannies of just a few leaves. So you want to leave some of the stamped leaves that have all that detail in the bright color, and then paint through a whole bunch of the rest of them. You can paint through some of the stamped ones, which is what I'm doing, because I don't want them all to look like they're in the front. I just want some of them to look like they're in the front. And all I have to do is paint over the rest of them. Again, in the same kind of just big broad brush, whack over top of them, but leave a few of them up on the surface in the foreground. And that's going to start to create some dimension. It already is, even though I've only got these two colors in it. And it's really easy to do because I'm just painting over top of all that stuff that I sketched in there with my Sharpie marker. The Sharpie marker, by the way, is waterproof. So if you're trying to do something that you want to paint on, make sure you're using something waterproof. Microns will also work for something like this. And I added a little darker color into some of the leaves that have holes in them, just so I get more detail that way. Now next up, I added in some perylene green. Perylene green is a very dark green. You could also mix your whatever your green is. If you have sap green, you could mix that with a dark grayish color, a very dark blue, that kind of thing, in order to get something really dark. And you'll also want it to possibly be a little thicker than the last layer. And in between each layer, you'll just dry it. So you want to have nothing that is going to drag your paint all over the place. You can get nice crisp edges and you can get a very graphical look. But look at all that dimension that suddenly appeared just because I'm using these three greens together. Super easy to do this. Now the waterfall is not super easy. I'm just doing some sketchy lines that are vertical in a cobalt teal blue and wiping some of that off. I put more than I probably had intended. Wiping it off with a baby wipe, so I lift some of it. And then just in a few areas, I mix some cobalt blue with the cobalt teal blue. So I'd have a little different color in a few spots. And it'll indicate that there's some water flowing in the background. It's not a hugely important part of the picture. The greens are really the star of the show, so not really worried about that, but I just wanted something in there in that opening. Again, dry that so that you're not doing any touching of the birds to that, and then paint the birds. And I'm just gonna use a random bunch of colors, some yellows, reds, and blues, trying to keep the colors of the birds in harmony with each other, because then they'll stand out as a group versus the group of greens. And that's going to give some really nice balance to it, where I get to look around the whole thing, see all these birds in their different colors, and yet they're all framed by this gorgeous, really rich and contrasting set of greens in the background around them. And with each one of these, I'm drying in between if I want to change colors and touch the area next to something, because I don't want colors to bleed into each other. So your heat setter is your friend when you're doing something like this. If you're somebody who runs into, oh my goodness, my watercolor ran like crazy. And with this, notice that I also didn't put any branches for any of the birds. I wasn't really worried about it, except for when I was all finished, that bird on the upper right has this little claws hanging out in the front. And I did, at the very end, draw a little stick for him to stand on. But the rest of them are mostly standing on leaves. And even though the leaves might not hold their weight, I figured it was good enough for me. So I was going to let them stand on something a little bit softer like a leaf, instead of trying to draw in a whole bunch of branches on that. But the unified color in the birds worked really well to pull them all together. Instead of, I could have made a cacophony of way more colors, which is what a lot of these birds are. They're crazy colors, but I wanted them to not fight for as much attention as the individual leaves would, because there's just so much going on. I needed something for my eye to rest on. So there you go. See my little twig for that bird that needed something to stand on. Added my sentiment and put it on a card base. And this is going to go out to a friend of mine who's got a birthday coming up. So I thought this would be cute for her, because we are going to celebrate her birthday together. I'm so excited. Anybody else excited for getting together with other humans? I'll see you guys again next month. You take care. Have a great summer. Stay cool. I'll see you soon.